Welcome, everyone, to the Preschool Neuroscience Summit. Today, I'm really excited to have guest Mary Helen Immordino-Yang. I hope I pronounced that.
Yeah, you did.
She is coming to us from the USC Center for Effective Neuroscience Development, Learning, and Education, which is CANDLE for short. We'll have the links to all that. She's very kindly given us a resource, The Brain Basis for Integrated Social, Emotional, and Academic Development, How Emotions and Social Relationships Drive Learning. So we'll have the link to that. But she is a professor of education, psychology, and neuroscience at CANDLE and has been studying the brain and children and how emotion and self-awareness and social connections and cognitive and moral development work in educational settings. So I'm really excited to have her here today. She's also the mom of two teenagers, and she used to be a teacher herself. So welcome, Mary Helen. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So let's just talk a little bit about the brain. So we often think about emotions and cognition when we're talking about the brain. Are they two separate things, or should we think about them together?
Yeah, so, I think there's a long philosophical and scientific legacy in the Western world of thinking about cognition and emotion as separate. And in real people, they aren't, right? There's actually no such thing in the brain as a network that only manages emotion or only processes cognition. It doesn't exist. All of the networks are engaged and all the regions are engaged in different ways depending on how you're thinking, how you're feeling, and those thoughts and feelings are really integrated things. As scientists, of course, and as teachers too, we can sort of step back and study or observe the one dimension of someone's thought processes, right? Like a cognitive dimension of their thought process or the emotional dimension of it, and analyze that. But in the real person, that's not existing separate from the other half of the equation. And so it's really important, I think, to recognize, and it's fairly obvious, I think, at the preschool level. Like, it gets harder to make this argument, even though it's absolutely as true, for older children and adolescents and adults. But in preschoolers, right, it's like you guys know who work with preschoolers, that it's impossible to think about anything in a deep, consistent, like persistent way where you attend over time and really struggle with it, with making sense out of it and engage with it deeply, if you don't have any emotion about the situation. Like, our emotions are like the outboard motor that both steers the boat and pushes it forward. I mean, it's really not possible to think things without emotion, and it's also likewise not possible to have emotions without thoughts. I mean, why would you? Right? Like, the emotions are about things that you notice, that you recognize, that you think, or that happen, and that you then perceive and emote about, right? So it's like nonsensical to think about emotions and cognition as separate. And then the third leg of this stool is that our cognitions and our emotions are situated in a deeply social and cultural context. There's really, in that sense, again, we analyze in the Western world, especially from a scientific perspective, we like to analyze the individual, or maybe the individual as they interact with other individuals, right? As if there's a bunch of little independent billiard balls bouncing into each other on a table. But that's, again, not how our brains develop, not how we grow, not how we make meaning, not how we learn to think. We actually are deeply culturally situated beings, and our very biology is interdependent on the biology of others. And with preschoolers and young children, this is starkly true. I mean, there's actually, it's true across the lifespan, but it's painfully evident in preschoolers how the degree to which this is the case. I mean, when you think about, for example, the really heartbreaking examples of Romanian institutionally raised children, right? Where, families for a while, now those institutions, don't operate like this anymore because of this science that showed the effects. But, where families were leaving their infants at these institutions to be raised, hoping to, collect them again as teenagers. The infants who were left at these institutions had the food, they had, pretty adequate food, they had toys, they had each other, they had buildings with heat and beds and, diaper changes and all that. But what they didn't have is a family of adults who are in consistent relationship with them and who love them and kind of are there day in, day out, hour in, hour out to kind of co-regulate and sort of acculturate them into being a human. And when this happens, comparing, there's like a heartbreaking science paper about this where Chuck Nelson and Nathan Fox and their colleagues basically found as many foster families as they could for infants, and then they pulled their names out of hats and gave as many of them as they could to foster families, and then the rest were left at the institution where they had been dropped off by their parents to be raised. And I think we thought that these kids would be, relative to children raised in foster families, would be maybe cognitively delayed or socially inept or emotionally dysregulated. What you actually get are 17-year-old kids who are 3 feet tall. Right, their brains are a third smaller than those of their peers raised in families. Our biology, the legacy of our intelligence, is that we don't inherit a set of genes that tell our brains and bodies how to grow and how to think and how to behave like a human. Instead, what we have is a very complex set of what you might call contingency plans, right? Saying like, if you're in a world like this, grow like that. But if it's more like this, grow like that. And so what that leaves us with is an amazing amount of potential and plasticity to grow ourselves to fit into any context. And this is why human beings are all over the world, right? Unlike other animals who have to live in specific kinds of habitats to be able to survive. But at the same time, it also, the flip side of potential and plasticity and flexibility is codependency and vulnerability. We depend on one another to grow ourselves into functioning human beings. We literally teach our biology how to enact the instructions it was given, right, from our evolutionary legacy, through the feelings and physiological cues and social learning that we do in the space of relationships. And so it really is quite literally true that, for preschoolers especially, but for all people, the quality of our relationships, the quality of our shared experiences together grows our minds, brains, and physical bodies and health, right? Sets up our immune system, sets up certain aspects of our physiological regulation. Kids who are neglected or abused, right, aren't just more likely to have mental and psychological problems as adults. They're also more likely to have cancer and high blood pressure and diabetes and obesity, right? Things that have to do with bodily regulatory capacity. How much is appropriate to eat? How do I know how much sugar I need to have enough energy to live? How do I appropriately regulate my blood pressure given the amount of exercise I'm doing at this moment? We learn those things, not in the conscious sense, but we share, we co-regulate one another in our childhoods and throughout life, and actually set up our biological propensities and tendencies in large part via relationships. We come with a certain set of sort of primitives, if you will, and then those aren't exactly the same for everybody. There's differences across people for sure, and propensities or tendencies in particular directions, and then those get elaborated and expressed and built into something as the person interacts and lives in a social world. And so the work that you do as preschool teachers is absolutely critical for children's development, not only their quote unquote cognitive learning or their ability to manage their emotions or, maintain social communication appropriately, but also because their abilities to do all those things I just said are literally happening via the growing of the biology that undergirds them. So you're setting up their brains and bodies and physiological systems to be able to sustain them in healthy patterns into the next stages of life and the next stages and the next stages. So it's just absolutely important work, and also really, really grounded first and foremost in the culture of the interactions that you have, in the emotional tenor, in the cognitive opportunities that are afforded by these interactions and in these social spaces that we live in.
I think it's preschool teachers don't get enough credit.
Enough credit, right? It's hard, and it's also extremely important work, right? All teaching is really important work. Parenting too, right? All of that is critical. You're literally growing the next generation of people, right? Depending on how our world's going to be, is dependent on what you do now. Mm-hmm.
So, Mary Helen, when you think about, just going back to what you were talking about, the children that have maybe experienced some type of trauma, how easy or difficult is it to repair some of the damage that's been, if there's interventions? Is there a certain age range where that works better than others?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, always you can help people heal from things, right? I mean, and as educators, we always want to keep that in mind. There's no irreparable damage, right? And also, I think rather than thinking about things as damage, think about things as active adaptations on the part of the person to the world they were living in, right? So like I said, the flip side of the fact that we our biological development, our social, our cultural, our cognitive, our emotional development are sort of outsourced on triggers from the social world, from the physical world around us that help us to, turn on those mechanisms appropriately and tune them to the context in which we live. The quote unquote damage that happens in abuse or in neglect, neglect's a little bit different. We can talk about that, but in abusive situations or trauma is actually the flip side of that. It's the adaptation that the person's neurological and physiological systems make, and cognitive and emotional systems make, to be able to manage the best they can in the world in which they found themselves living. And so the habits they develop, the proclivities they develop, the emotional profiles they develop are actually adaptive in that context. If you live in a dangerous world, it pays to be anxious, because you better not let your guard down. You could get hurt. Let me just turn off my phone here. Right? So we think of these things as being broken children, but they're not broken. They're very fixed. This is the result of them, cobbling together a life that will actually work for them in the context in which they've found themselves. The problem comes when that context is not healthy for them, and the adaptations that they're developing are not useful in other contexts besides that one that they've found themselves in. And when they get into the bigger world, now they have habits that are maladaptive, that don't serve them well, and that are unhealthy. And so the way to work with that as teachers is to recognize that you can't do anything to people. You can't learn things to people. You can't give them the answer. You can't change a person, right? What you can do is, and this is always true, right, at every level, what you can do is strategically orchestrate the context for that child, so that the child is welcomed into or supported in reworking those patterns and experiencing their life in a different way, so that they come to expect a different kind of world around them, and then develop themselves in accordance with that, which is another way of saying they are healthier and they're, better adapted to living in the bigger world that we all share together, into a healthier world we all share together. So it's extremely difficult work, because you can't, like I said, you can't reach into a child and change them directly. What you can do is try to think strategically about how you can set up that child's context so that they can start to build the habits that they naturally would fall into in a context like that, that would be more beneficial for them, that would over time start to reorganize the way in which they experience the world, and the way in which their reactions are modulated, and the way in which they think about things. So that's kind of a long-winded answer to your really tough question, but what it basically emphasizes is that people grow themselves. You can't grow them, but what you can do is love them into the self they need to be, so that they can grow themselves into that space. And yes, there are, for the second half of your question, there are sort of sensitive periods in which this happens more readily, because there's a lot of physical and social growth during those periods. And so when you have a lot of growth and shifting and dynamic change, this affords us opportunities to rework things, right? And is also a vulnerable period, because you're reworking things in accordance with what you experienced during that period. So it's especially important to provide high quality experiences for people at those times. And those times are times that you would imagine, like infancy and early childhood, are particularly sensitive periods because there's so much growth happening. So how are you going to shape that growth, right? And then there are other echoes of that kind of plasticity and potential, where there are periods of life that involve really extensive reworking and plasticity, and also vulnerability. And those are periods of life when you have a lot of hormonal change, physiological development, and social role growth. Those always go together. That's how our organism is built, right? So adolescence is a major period of neurological growth and reworking of brain networks that undergird, executive functioning, emotional feelings, habits of mind, dispositions of engagement. And then a next wave of really marked plasticity or potential for change and reworking in the brain and health is the next time in which most people experience major hormonal and social role growth, which is during the transition to parenting. And so as preschool teachers, you kind of hit both ends, because you're also dealing with young parents who also are in a period of marked neurological plasticity and vulnerability. And so in working with their children and with them, you have the opportunity to really shape the growth of the family, not just the child as an individual. So again, your work is really complex and important for society and for humanity.
For sure. Thank you for sharing all that. So Mary Helen, what would you say are kind of what advice would you give to preschool teachers when they have a whole class of 3 or 4-year-olds or 4 or 5-year-olds that have all different needs and different personalities and things? Are there any kind of general things we should think about when it comes to the emotional and cognitive development of the preschoolers' brains and their learning?
I think there are a couple fundamental principles. Like the first is that relationships and the way people feel is absolutely central to how they think. right? You think in the space of relationships and emotional feelings, right? That depending on how you're feeling, that's going to shape what you're likely to think about next. And so are you likely to think about this painting you're making? Or are you likely to think about, you'd be worried and miss your parent? Or are you likely to, just go out of control emotionally if you're a 3-year-old and start, spinning off in directions that don't work out in a group setting, right? So, I think really attending as objectively as you can, well, I would say as subjectively as you can, actually, because you know the kids, right? To the emotional experience, the subjectively perceived emotional experience of the child, right? And I know that's incredibly hard work, right? But that's something that's necessary. And it also means that preschools need to have a high ratio of teachers to students, right? You can't do this with 50 kids at once. And then it also means strategically setting up the culture of the classroom environment, and the opportunities there, and the habits and dispositions that children are expected to kind of grow into, in ways that really facilitate safety, emotional engagement, authentic, whole participation in the activities. And the opposite of that would be shunning kids or punishing kids or pushing kids out, or making environments that are not conducive to children being able to be process-oriented rather than outcome-oriented, right? It's not about the work you do or what you can achieve at any stage in life, actually. But in preschool, this is just really in your face, right? It's about the ways in which you go about thinking and acting and achieving. And it's the processes you're supporting, not the outcomes. And when you think about how you support the ongoing processing and the dispositions that those develop, which become sort of habits, those make people feel safe, they make people feel secure, they give them sort of schemas of mind, sort of patterns, ways to know how to get what you need when you need it, right? What's the appropriate way to express this or that when you have a need, and to become aware of it. And so you're laying out these very, very basic patterns of social engagement, of cognitive engagement, of motivation, of emotional regulation that kids are slowly growing themselves into. And it's a slow process. It's a process that takes deep care on the part of the adults to really support. And it's a process which cannot be shortchanged or shortcut. You can't give it to somebody, right? It's something that people need to grow themselves into. So your job as a preschool teacher is to set the context where kids are really likely to grow in the ways that you think are beneficial for them, and not in other ways.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. Just before we end today, I just wanted to ask you about this time of COVID, and a lot of preschool teachers are teaching on Zoom, which has to be very difficult.
That I can't even imagine. I have teenagers learning on Zoom, and it's already a strain. Like, how you keep a 3-year-old's attention on a Zoom is,
Yeah, I just wondered if, because the relationships are so important, and that kind of physical contact as well, if you think there'll be, we don't know how long it's going to go on for, but is Zoom better than no Zoom? I guess I'm asking.
I don't know the answer to that question. We can all only speculate because it hasn't been happening long enough for us to really study it. There's classic work by people like Pat Kuhl and, Andy Meltzoff and others that shows that, very young children, and this is a little younger than preschool, kids in their first year of life and into the first half of the second year of life, right? They don't learn from adults on screens. They don't learn from TV and things like that. There's something about the physical presence of another person that triggers their biological brain, right? To say like, this is something that is that matters, right? Like, this is something that it counts as a human thing. Let's do it in a human way. right? Somehow, like this is language versus just interesting noise, right? And, you know, when it comes out of a screen, it's interesting noise. When it comes out of a person, it's language. So you attend in a different way, and it grows the child's ability and brain in a different way. What this looks like in 3, 4, 5-year-olds, and of course 3 and 5 are really different, right? 3 is very different than 5. You know, they're fading out of that and into an ability to kind of conjure for themselves the social relationship that isn't really physically there, without many of the very subtle but very important and evolutionarily really deep running, in a lot of cases, physiological cues that we all perceive, but that children really rely on directly from the social world to be able to know how and when to engage. Subtle things that we take for granted, like direct eye contact, and you know, overhearing the other person's pattern of breathing. Right, where if somebody goes, right, it means they're focusing, and then you sitting next to them tend to do that too, right? And that's how the 3-year-old starts to learn. Well, when we're reading books, you stop and focus. This is not the time to flip your attention around the room, right? And you're starting to train up those systems to say, like, now we're reading a book, we're going to look here, right? And then we're going to go play out toys, and then you run, right? And so without that, I think it's got to be extremely difficult for young children to get out of a Zoom what they would get out of a personal interaction. In fact, it's probably impossible. That said, I think a lot could probably be accomplished via Zoom indirectly, to the extent possible that you engage others from the child's immediate physical context, their parent, their caregiver, their older siblings, even their pet, right? If there's one in the frame, right? So if you as the teacher, rather than directly teaching the student, can be engaging with the student indirectly via the parent, via the others in the room, so that you're helping them know how to be a surrogate teacher, right? In effect, like teaching them how to teach their child and leading them into the kinds of activities and patterns of thinking that are that you would do in an in-person preschool setting. Then that may be your best hope of actually being able to help children grow during this time. I think it would be unrealistic to expect a 3-year-old on their own to sit in front of a Zoom and actually learn what you expect them to learn. Even if they appear to be attending, what they're getting is probably very, very different than, and I actually would kind of worry about a 3-year-old who could attend for a really long time to somebody on a Zoom without, you know what I mean? I mean, I'd worry that child has some real atypical ways of perceiving social signals, and they may not be actually perceiving the person on the screen as a being at all, you know. So I think it's about finding ways to support the real physical people in a child's life to be able to engage that child in ways that will help them develop the skills and the patterns and dispositions of thinking that are going to serve them well as they move forward, rather than trying to directly teach the kids.
Well, thank you.
Yes. If anybody's making it work directly teaching 3-year-olds on Zoom, by all means, let me know.
Yeah, it's difficult time, so
very
all in the experiment right now, so
yeah.
trial.
I mean, I should say, as the kids get older, 5 years old, some 4-year-olds, depending on their maturity level, 5 years old, I mean, it might be able to have very targeted, specific Zoom gatherings that somehow engage kids in a conversation around the things that they've been doing, right, somehow, and then help them to re-represent that, and then maybe help them think about what that work means, and then send them off with their carer or their sibling or their whatever to do some kind of work, right, and then come back later and share it with each other, so that you're helping them build a sort of a social set of connections and relationships in the preschool that is now on a Zoom, but all the work can't be done directly that way. That would never work.
For sure. Well, thank you so much, Mary Helen, for sharing all your wisdom and knowledge and taking the time to come on here.
Welcome.
Remind everyone, we'll have the links and also Mary Helen's book, Emotions, Learning, and the Brain. We'll have a link to that as well, and the freebie that she's given you to learn more. But thanks again for taking the time.
You're so welcome, and thank you for doing the work that you do, all of you preschool teachers right now. Like, my heart goes out to you. You have a very, very hard job. And, get creative, dig in, because the thing is, you make a huge difference to children and their families. And, I really think there might be some, painful as it is, there might be some opportunities here that you wouldn't have otherwise had to really, like I said, grow the family instead of, the young parent together with the child, by teaching young parents, ways of engaging with their 3, 4, 5-year-old productively, that grow these habits, that help them learn to think in complex ways, and to be interested in things and curious, and to engage with ideas, and as much as they drive you nuts, asking why, right? So I think that if you can leverage that opportunity, it could actually work out okay.
Yeah, exactly. There's other things to explore. So, but thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.